The lunch rush at Gracie's cafe hummed with life. The bell above the door chimed as a man in his early 30s stepped inside, shaking the rain from his coat. Ethan Walsh scanned the cozy room, his sharp eyes taking in the black and white checkered floor and the worn teal booths. The warm, bustling atmosphere felt worlds apart from the polished but cold restaurants he usually dined at. Adjusting his tie, he hesitated before sliding into a corner booth. Behind the counter, Sophie Bennett balanced trays and took orders with the effortless grace of someone who had been doing this for years. Her bright smile and lighthearted banter kept customers returning, even if the exhaustion in her eyes betrayed her long hours. When she spotted the unfamiliar face, curiosity flickered across her features. Grabbing a menu, she made her way over. "Welcome to Gracie's," she said cheerfully, tucking a stray hair behind her ear. "What can I get you?" Ethan glanced at the menu but looked uneasy. Just water, please." Sophie arched an eyebrow. "Just water? Not even a piece of pie to go with it?" He hesitated, then exhaled slowly. "Lost my wallet. Guess today's not my lucky day." Her gaze flickered to his scuffed shoes and slightly crooked tie. His suit was neat, but there was a wariness to him that wasn't just about money. "Well," she said with a shrug and a smile, "lunch is on me today." Ethan blinked, caught off guard. "You don't have to do that. I can." "Everyone has tough days," Sophie interrupted, waving away his protests. "Besides, it's just a sandwich. The world could use more kindness, right?" For a moment, Ethan simply stared at her. In his world, favors always came with strings. Yet here was this waitress offering something freely. "Okay," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Thank you. I'll have the turkey club." As Sophie walked back to place his order, Ethan leaned against the booth. A strange but welcome warmth settled over him. Minutes later, she returned with his sandwich and a glass of water. "Here you go. Enjoy." "Thanks," he said, glancing at her name tag. "Sophie, right?" "That's me," she replied with a grin before hurrying off to another table. Ethan ate slowly, letting his thoughts drift. He had wandered into the cafe on impulse, searching for a sliver of normalcy in a life that felt increasingly detached. Now, he found his eyes following Sophie as she moved between tables, her ponytail swinging with every step. When he finished, Ethan approached the counter just as Sophie finished ringing up another customer. "That was great," he said, slipping his hands into his pockets. "I owe you one." Sophie smiled softly. "Just come back when you're having a better day." He chuckled. "I might take you up on that." As Ethan pushed the door open, he paused for a final glance back at her. Sophie was already wiping down a booth, the hum of the cafe swirling around her. Something about her was different. "She's different," Ethan murmured to himself as he stepped into the rain. The patter of rain followed him down the street, but Sophie's unexpected kindness stayed with him. For the first time in months, he felt something stir, hope. The next day, the bell chimed again, and Sophie looked up from behind the counter. There he was, Ethan Walsh. This time, his coat wasn't soaked, and his smile seemed a little less hesitant. "Back so soon?" Sophie teased, making her way over. "Well," Ethan said, smoothing his now neatly combed hair, "you did tell me to come back, though I might still owe you one." "Wallet trouble again?" Sophie crossed her arms playfully. "I'm beginning to look like a freeloader, huh?" Sophie laughed, surprising herself at how easy the exchange felt. "Guilty as charged, but I'll let it slide. I hate wasting a perfectly good turkey club." From that day on, Ethan became a regular fixture at Gracie's. Twice a week, without fail, he would settle into his usual booth. His order never changed: turkey club and water. Each time he offered a half-hearted excuse about his wallet, and each time Sophie brushed it off with a knowing smile. During the quieter moments, Ethan watched her weave between tables, her energy unwavering despite the relentless pace. Over time, he began noticing the little things, the way she slipped an extra cookie to the elderly couple in the corner, how she greeted every customer by name, and the soft sighs she let out when no one was watching. One afternoon, after the lunch crowd thinned, Ethan lingered at his table. When Sophie finally caught a breather, she slid into the seat across from him, wiping her hands on her apron. "Not in a hurry today?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Not really," Ethan admitted. "Busy day for you?" she shrugged. "Every day's busy. Bills don't pay themselves." Ethan's brow furrowed. "Bills?" Sophie hesitated, but something in his calm demeanor made her open up. My dad passed a few years ago, she said quietly. Left behind some debts. My little brother's in college, studying to be a teacher. Someone's got to keep things afloat. Ethan leaned back, genuinely impressed. That's a lot to take on. It's life, she said, offering a small smile. You do what you have to. As Ethan left Gracie's that day, his thoughts lingered on Sophie. Her kindness wasn't just a reflex, it was deeply rooted, shaped by struggle and resilience. In his world, filled with wealth and power, people rarely gave without expecting something in return. But Sophie did, and that left a mark on him far deeper than he expected. Ethan Walsh had become a part of the rhythm at Gracie's cafe. Each visit, he arrived a little earlier and lingered a little longer. Initially, he told himself it was the turkey club that kept him coming back, but deep down, he knew it was Sophie Bennett. There was something about her, the way her laugh warmed the room, how she remembered every customer's name, and the small but consistent gestures of kindness she offered. In a world where people Ethan usually encountered were fixated on wealth and status, Sophie felt like a breath of fresh air. But with every warm conversation and every shared smile, Ethan felt a quiet weight settle deeper in his chest. He wasn't being honest. One slow afternoon, as Sophie cleared his table, she lingered for a moment, playfully balancing the tray on her hip. You know, she teased, you're lucky I'm such a generous waitress. One day, you might have to return the favor. Ethan chuckled softly, but her words struck a nerve. What could he possibly do to repay her kindness, especially when she didn't know the full story? As he watched her walk to another table, a thought crossed his mind. What would Sophie think if she knew the truth? He pushed the thought aside, but it hovered long after he stepped out into the cool afternoon air. Over the weeks, Gracie's became more than just a lunch spot for Ethan. It became a retreat. He found excuses to stop by, even if only for a coffee. He wasn't sure when it happened, but soon enough, he looked forward to seeing Sophie more than anything else in his day. One afternoon, the cafe was unusually quiet. Sophie took the rare opportunity to slide into the booth across from him during her break, her hands cradling a cup of steaming coffee. You're here a lot, she remarked with a grin. Guilty, Ethan admitted, leaning back. You know, Sophie began, taking a sip. You're always asking about me. What about you? What do you do outside of Gracie's? Ethan hesitated, swirling his drink absently. Business, he answered vaguely. Sophie arched an eyebrow. Mysterious. It's not as interesting as working at a cafe, he said, steering the conversation away. But what about you? What do you do for yourself? Sophie blinked, clearly surprised by the question. For myself? She echoed, laughing lightly. Between shifts here and covering bills, not much time left for hobbies. There must be something, Ethan pressed, tilting his head. Sophie hesitated, then shrugged. I like to paint. Haven't had much time for it lately, but I've always dreamed of opening a small art studio. A little place where people could create. You know, nothing fancy. Ethan's interest piqued. That sounds incredible. Why haven't you done it? Dreams don't pay the bills, Sophie replied with a sigh, swirling the coffee in her mug. Who has the money for something like that? Ethan wanted to say, I do. He wanted to tell her he could turn that dream into reality with one phone call. Instead, he only nodded. Maybe someday. Maybe, Sophie agreed with a wistful smile. Ethan thought about that conversation long after he left the cafe. Sophie's quiet resilience, her ability to smile despite life's challenges, stayed with him. But as his affection for Sophie grew, so did his guilt. He wasn't just some ordinary guy down on his luck. Ethan Walsh was one of the wealthiest men in the city, a name that appeared in business magazines and headlines. The longer he stayed silent, the harder it became to imagine telling her the truth. One evening, as Ethan left the cafe, he overheard Sophie speaking with one of her co-workers. The roof's still leaking, Sophie sighed. Gracie's has been trying to get it fixed for months, but repairs like that cost a fortune. That night, Ethan made a call. By the end of the week, a repair crew had quietly come and gone, leaving the cafe's roof good as new. The next time Ethan walked in, Sophie practically beamed. You won't believe it, she said as she approached his booth. Someone fixed the roof. Gracie swears she didn't hire anyone, so it must have been one of the regulars. Ethan feigned surprise. Really? That's great news. But as Sophie laughed, Ethan felt the familiar twinge of guilt. He wanted to tell her it was him, but feared she'd see it as manipulation instead of a genuine gesture. On a quiet afternoon a week later, Sophie slid into Ethan's booth again. "You know," she teased, "for someone who's always here, I'm not entirely sure you work." Ethan laughed nervously. "Of course I do. Everyone's got to work, right?" "What is it you actually do?" she asked, her tone light but curious. Ethan hesitated, offering his usual vague response. "I'm in business." Sophie narrowed her eyes playfully but let it slide. "Mysterious businessman. Got it." She stood, smoothing her apron. "Speaking of mysteries, think I'll finally paint something this weekend." Ethan exhaled quietly as she walked away, but Sophie's lingering glance over her shoulder told him she was more curious than she let on. That night, Ethan lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Sophie deserved to know the truth, but would she understand, or would the knowledge of his wealth undo everything between them? Ethan Walsh sat in his usual booth at Gracie's cafe, absently flipping through his phone. The late morning sun streamed through the window, but his mind was elsewhere. He was jolted back to reality when he heard his name. His real name, Ethan Walsh. A man's voice echoed from the counter, loud enough for the entire cafe to hear. "You're the guy who started Walsh Tech, right? What are you doing in a place like this?" Ethan's hand froze midair, his coffee cup trembling slightly. Sophie Bennett, who had been clearing a nearby table, turned abruptly at the sound. Her eyes narrowed as recognition dawned. The man at the counter continued, oblivious to the tension he'd just caused. "I've read about you. Self-made millionaire, right? My sister works for one of your companies." Ethan forced a tight smile, trying to play it down. "I like to keep a low profile," he replied, casting a nervous glance at Sophie. Sophie stood motionless, tray clutched tightly in her hand. Confusion flickered across her face, quickly giving way to something deeper: hurt. As soon as the customer left, Sophie marched straight to Ethan's booth. Her voice was low, trembling with restrained anger. "So," she began, her eyes sharp, "all this time you've been lying to me?" Ethan looked up, guilt evident in his expression. "Sophie, I can explain." "You're a millionaire," she cut him off, her voice tightening. "A tech mogul. And you've been sitting here letting me pay for your lunches, pretending to be, what, broke?" "I wasn't pretending," Ethan said, his voice calm but strained. "I just didn't tell you." Sophie let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "Didn't tell me?" She shook her head. "I've been offering you free sandwiches, thinking you couldn't afford them. And all this time, you're living in a penthouse somewhere?" Ethan stood, desperate to explain. "I wanted to know if someone could care about me for who I am, not what I have. My whole life, people have only seen the money, not me." Tears welled in Sophie's eyes, but her voice remained steady. "And you thought it was okay to turn my kindness into a test? Do you have any idea how humiliating that is?" Ethan took a cautious step closer. "It wasn't a test, Sophie. I didn't plan this. I didn't want to lose what we had." "What we had?" Sophie's voice cracked. "Ethan, you built it on a lie. How can I trust that any of this was real?" She didn't wait for an answer. Spinning on her heels, she stormed out of the cafe. The bell above the door jingled as she left Ethan standing there, alone in the crowded room. Sophie gripped the steering wheel tightly as she drove home, blinking back tears. She replayed every conversation, every joke, and every quiet moment she and Ethan had shared. Now, each memory felt twisted, tainted by his deception. She had believed him to be an ordinary guy, someone who needed a break from life's pressures. She had poured her heart into their friendship, offering him pieces of herself without hesitation. Now she felt like a fool. That evening, Sophie sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the blank canvas she had planned to paint. The joy that art usually brought her felt distant, overshadowed by the sting of betrayal. Across town, Ethan stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, the city skyline stretching out beneath him. His reflection stared back, a reminder of the man he didn't want to be. Sophie's words echoed in his mind, cutting deeper with every replay. She was right. Even if he hadn't meant to, he had turned her generosity into something transactional. He picked up his phone and hovered over her number. After a moment of hesitation, he pressed call. It rang twice, then went to voicemail. "Sophie," he said quietly, "please let me explain. I'm sorry. I never wanted to hurt you." He hung up, knowing words wouldn't fix this. Days passed, but Sophie didn't return his calls. At Gracie's, her coworkers informed him that she had taken some time off. Ethan sat in his usual booth, staring at the empty seat across from him. The turkey club he had ordered sat untouched. Doubt crept in, gnawing at him. What if he had lost her for good? That evening, Ethan made a series of phone calls. The first was to his financial advisor, arranging to clear the remaining debts Sophie's father had left behind. He didn't want her carrying that weight alone. Next, he contacted a foundation he had supported for years, setting up a scholarship for Sophie's younger brother. The paperwork would reflect the brother's merit. Ethan's involvement would remain hidden. But it still didn't feel like enough. Ethan remembered Sophie mentioning painting one afternoon at the cafe. She had brushed it off as impractical, but he saw the light in her eyes when she spoke about it. That night, he carefully selected the best art supplies, canvases, brushes, and paints, and arranged for them to be delivered to Gracie's with a handwritten note. Sophie, your kindness inspired me in ways I can never repay. Use these to follow your dreams. You deserve every success. A grateful friend. A week later, Sophie returned to Gracie's. As she walked through the door, one of her coworkers handed her a large box. The cafe staff gathered as she carefully opened it, revealing the art supplies inside. Her heart pounded as she read the note twice. No signature, no name, but deep down, she knew. Sophie Bennett's hands trembled slightly as she unwrapped the art supplies at Gracie's cafe. Brushes, canvases, and paints lay nestled inside the box, more than she had ever been able to afford for herself. Who sent this? One of her coworkers asked, peering over her shoulder. Sophie's eyes scanned the note tucked inside. The words felt carefully chosen, personal. Your kindness inspired me in ways I can never repay. Use these to follow your dreams. You deserve every success. A grateful friend. No signature. Sophie read the note twice, her heart racing. Her thoughts drifted immediately to Ethan Walsh, but the idea left her uneasy. Could he really have done this, without expecting anything in return? Later that evening, Sophie found an envelope in her mailbox. Inside was a letter from the bank. Her father's remaining debts had been cleared. She stared at the page in disbelief. As if the night couldn't hold any more surprises, her brother called moments later, excitement vibrating through the phone. Sophie, I just got an email. I've been offered a scholarship, full ride. Can you believe it? Sophie sat on the edge of her bed, holding the phone in one hand and the bank letter in the other. The art supplies rested against the wall, untouched but glowing with possibility. She felt the pieces clicking together. Ethan hadn't done any of this to impress her. He had done it quietly, leaving no trace of his involvement, except for the lingering warmth she felt in her chest. The resentment she had clung to began to soften, dissolving into something gentler, a mix of gratitude and longing she couldn't quite shake. A week later, Sophie received an elegant invitation in the mail. The location read Blue Ridge Art Gallery. The event's title was simple but striking, a celebration of talent, resilience, and beauty. Curiosity tugged at her, and despite lingering hesitation, she decided to go. When she arrived, Sophie froze at the entrance. Her paintings, pieces she had sketched and stashed away at Gracie's, never thinking they would see the light of day, hung prominently on the walls. The soft light of the gallery made the colors bloom in a way she had never imagined. The room was filled with familiar faces, her brother, co-workers, regulars from the cafe, and even neighbors she hadn't seen in years. And at the center of it all, standing nervously beneath one of her larger canvases, was Ethan. Sophie approached slowly, her breath catching. Ethan straightened the moment he saw her, his usual calm demeanor replaced by visible nerves. I didn't expect this, Sophie said softly, her eyes moving across the room. Ethan stepped closer, his voice low but full of sincerity. I wanted to show you how extraordinary you are, he said. You've spent so long giving to everyone else. I thought maybe you needed someone to remind you what you deserve. Sophie looked around, at the art, at her loved ones, at Ethan standing right in front of her. I'm sorry, Ethan continued, for hiding the truth. I should have trusted you from the start, but everything we've shared, every conversation, every laugh, was real. I didn't want to lose that. Sophie's eyes glistened, but she held steady. It's not about the money, Ethan. It's about trust. You tested me without even realizing it, and that hurt. Ethan nodded, his gaze never leaving hers. I know, and I'll spend every day proving to you that I won't make that mistake again. A faint smile tugged at Sophie's lips, despite the tear threatening to slip down her cheek. "You're good at grand gestures," she said, her voice softening. "But earning trust isn't about one big thing. It's a lot of little things." "I'm not going anywhere," Ethan replied earnestly. The gallery buzzed quietly around them, but for a moment it felt like they were the only two people in the room. Sophie's expression softened further. "I forgive you," she said. "But don't think this makes it easy. You've got work to do." Relief swept over Ethan like a wave. Fair enough. The months that followed were slow but deliberate. Ethan didn't push for more than Sophie was ready to give. Instead, he supported her in quiet, meaningful ways, helping her browse art stores, scouting locations for potential studios, and encouraging her to apply for local art grants. Bit by bit, Sophie let her guard down. One evening, as they painted together in Sophie's small apartment-turned-studio, she nudged him with the end of her brush, smirking at his less-than-perfect attempt at a landscape. "You're not terrible at this," she teased. Ethan laughed, holding up his canvas, which looked more like abstract chaos than a sunset. "If all else fails, maybe you'll hire me as your assistant." Sophie's eyes softened, her teasing giving way to something deeper. "I think we make a pretty good team." Months later, Sophie's long-held dream finally came to life. The studio, bright, warm, and filled with natural light, opened its doors to the community. At the grand opening, Ethan stood by her side, watching as guests marveled at her work. Friends, family, and even Gracie's regulars poured in to celebrate. As the evening wound down and the last guest left, Ethan gently took Sophie's hand, guiding her to the center of the room. "What's this about?" she asked, curiosity flickering in her eyes. Ethan gestured to one of her paintings, a sunrise over a lake filled with warmth and quiet beauty. Beneath it sat a small, painted wooden box. Ethan opened it, revealing a simple yet elegant ring, the inside of the lid decorated with a smaller version of the sunrise. "Sophie," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "when I met you, I was lost. You showed me a kindness I didn't deserve, and somewhere along the way, I fell in love with you." He took a steadying breath. "You've given me more than I can ever repay. Will you let me spend the rest of my life showing you how much I love you?" Tears welled in Sophie's eyes as she nodded, a soft smile breaking across her face. "Yes," she whispered, "but this time, lunch is on me." "Yes," Sophie Bennett whispered with a tearful smile, "but this time, lunch is on me. Forever." Their wedding took place a few months later, right in the art studio that had become a symbol of their journey together. The room, filled with warm light and vibrant colors, radiated both the simplicity that defined Sophie's spirit and the understated elegance that reflected Ethan's quiet devotion. In one corner, the staff from Gracie's Cafe chatted and laughed alongside Ethan's high-profile colleagues and business associates. The blend of two worlds, so different yet harmonized by love, created an atmosphere unlike any other. As the music filled the space, Ethan took Sophie's hand and led her onto the dance floor. The soft glow of the overhead lights framed them as they swayed gently. Sophie leaned closer, her head resting against his chest. "You taught me," she whispered, "that true wealth isn't in money, it's in kindness and love." Ethan smiled, his lips brushing her forehead. "And you showed me," he replied softly, "what it means to be truly seen." As the music swelled, Ethan spun Sophie, their shared laughter floating through the studio, mingling with the voices of friends and family. The people who mattered most to them celebrated, not just their love, but the lessons their story carried. That connection transcends wealth. That kindness can change lives. On the far wall, the painting of a sunrise over the lake, the one that had inspired Ethan's proposal, hung proudly. Beneath it, a small plaque read, "Inspire and be inspired," dedicated to the power of kindness. Thank you for joining us on this heartfelt journey of love, second chances, and the quiet power of compassion. Sophie and Ethan's story reminds us that the greatest treasures in life are not measured in dollars, but in the connections we build and the kindness we show to one another. If this story touched your heart, please don't forget to like this video, share it with friends, subscribe to our channel, Soul Stirring Stories. For more inspiring tales that warm the soul and brighten your day, make sure to turn on the notification bell. We can't wait to share more stories with you, stories that remind us all of the beauty of love, compassion, and human connection. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next story.